Almost 250 years ago, a group of our nation's greatest minds came together in Pennsylvania State Hall, now known as Independence Hall, and officially declared our independence from the British. And over the next 250 years, we became the world's uncontested superpower. But how exactly did we come from a small group of 13 colonies to the world's #1 player? Well, in today's video, I'll explain a brief history of what led to the United States' current state. In 1492, Christopher Columbus, on an expedition to find an alternative route to East Asia, stumbled upon a land at the time unknown to Europe. This, of course, was the Americas. Many European powers wanted a piece of the land and the resources in the Americas, including Spain, Portugal, France, Denmark, and Britain. Britain started 13 original colonies, which in order of founding was Virginia, founded in 1602, Massachusetts, founded in 1620, New Hampshire, founded in 1623, Maryland, founded in 1632, Connecticut and Rhode Island, both founded in 1636, Delaware, founded in 1638, North and South Dakota, founded in 1663, New York, originally founded by the Dutch in 1624 but captured by Britain in 1664, and New Jersey, founded by the Dutch in 1660 but also captured by Britain in 1664. Then there was Pennsylvania, founded in 1681, and finally Georgia, founded in 1732. The first war that included the original 13 colonies was King William's War, started in 1689, when fighting broke out between New England and New France along with their respective Native American allies. This was caused because of King William III's joining of an alliance against the expansionist ambitions of King Louis XIV. The fighting lasted until the signing of the Treaty of Ryswick in 1697. Next was Queen Anne's War, which was fought in the starting of 1702 and lasted till 1713. It was fought between Britain, France, and Spain for control of the continent, with each European power relying on their Native American allies. Queen Anne's War officially concluded with the signing of the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, where Britain gained a large amount of territory like Newfoundland, Acadia, and the Hudson Bay. Spain was forced to let the Britain have access to the Ascendia, which was a highly lucrative monopoly supplying enslaved peoples to the Spanish colonies in the Americas. France suffered political, territorial, and economic setbacks. The Dummer War, also known as Father Rail's War, was a series of conflicts fought between New England and the French colonies, starting in 1722. It was caused by the Massachusetts Bay Colony continuing to build forts and settle towns along the Kennebec and Androscoggin rivers in Maine, violating prior treaties that protected Native American land rights. The war ended with Dummer's Treaty in 1725, although fighting continued, and then it continued to wind down with subsequent agreements in 1727. The War of Jenkins' Ear started in 1739 between Britain and Spain. This war was almost fought entirely at sea. It was caused because the Spanish Coast Guard intercepted the British brig called Rebecca in the Caribbean, accusing Captain Robert Jenkins of smuggling. They searched the vessel, pillaged the cargo, and allegedly severed Jenkins' ear. The war concluded in 1748 with the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. From 1744 to 1748, King George's War was fought. It was fought between the English and the French. It was fought due to similar reasons as King William's War and Queen Anne's War. During it, a colonial army besieged and captured the French fortress of Louisbourg on Cape Breton Island. It was the most significant victory of the war. King George's War was concluded with the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, along with the War of Jenkins' Ear. The treaty mandated that all lands seized during the war be returned to their original owners. This decision frustrated American colonists who felt their regional security and interest were being sacrificed for European goals. Next is the French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War. This conflict was sparked in 1754 when a young militia officer named George Washington led an attack on the French detachment at Jumonville Glen in present-day Pennsylvania. Early in the war, the French and their Native American allies used guerrilla tactics to dominate the region. However, in 1757, British Prime Minister William Pitt heavily increased British troops and financing in the colonies. By 1759, the British won a decisive victory at the Battle of Quebec. Montreal surrendered to Britain in 1760. The war ended on February 10th, 1763. Britain gained Canada and all French territories east of the Mississippi River, as well as Florida from Spain. The war resulted in massive financial debt for the British Empire. To pay for this, the British began levying heavy taxes on the American colonists, such as the Stamp Act, combining with King George's III's Royal Proclamation of 1763, which barred colonists from settling the newly won western frontier, which created a deep resentment that directly fueled the American Revolution. On October 26, 1774, the First Continental Congress gathered. It was a convention of 56 delegates representing 12 colonies. Georgia was the only colony to not send a representative. During this gathering, Congress declared that Britain had no right to tax the colonies. They also agreed to boycott British goods, dropping imports from Britain by 97% from 1774 to 1775. General Thomas Gage dissolved the mass. Later, Gage began to hear rumors that colonists were stockpiling weapons and gunpowder in the town of Concord. He also heard that two key rebel leaders, Samuel Adams and John Hancock, were staying in Lexington, which was on the road to Concord. Next is the American Revolutionary War. This was a war between Great Britain and its 13 colonies, with the 13 colonies defending their rights and winning their independence from the British, becoming the sovereign nation of the United States of America. Over 8 years of fighting, starting in 1775 and lasting until 1783 with the signing of the Treaty of Paris. At first, the American side in the Revolutionary War was fought by local colonial militias, otherwise called Minutemen. But then, on May 10th, 1775, the Second Continental Congress gathered, forming the Continental Army on June 15th, 1775, and appointing George Washington as its commander, as well as the first drafting of the Declaration of Independence and the Articles of Confederation. The Battle of Lexington and Concord was the first military engagement of the Revolutionary War, fought on April 15, 1775. The Battle of Lexington and Concord was considered the point of no return. On June 11, 1776, Congress ordered a draft of the Declaration of Independence, appointing Robert R. Livingston, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and John Adams to write it. However, they decided that Thomas Jefferson would write the first draft, and on July 4, 1776, the Declaration of Independence announced the sovereignty of the 13 colonies. At 4 a.m. on December 26, 1776, 2,400 American soldiers being commanded by George Washington marched toward the town of Trenton. Around 8 a.m., Washington's army reached Trenton. The Hussars, which were mercenary soldiers from the German state of Hesse who fought for the British, were caught completely off guard. They attempted to form lines, but the American cannons were already devastating to the sun. and part of that artillery formation was commanded by Alexander Hamilton. Within an hour, the Hassans surrendered to the Americans. The Americans only suffered 2 deaths, which were from exposure and not from gunfire, and 5 wounded. 22 Hassans were killed, 83 were wounded, and 800 to 900 surrendered. At least 500 escaped. On September 11th, 1776, the Battle of Brandywine Creek was fought between the American Continental Army of General George Washington and the British Army of General Sir William Howe. On August 25th, General Howe was moving his light infantry unit of 15,000 to the mouth of Elk River, 30 miles south of Philadelphia. Washington had been convinced since early March of 1777 that Howe was going to move his army to Philadelphia. As Howe and his army moved slowly, reaching the Brandywine River about half the distance to Philadelphia, on September 11th, they met Washington's army of around 10,000 Continental troops. While General Washington was on their way to meet Howe's army, they were joined by Maurice de Lafayette. Lafayette was a 19-year-old French nobleman who offered to serve in Washington's army without pay. When Washington reached Brandywine Creek on September 9th, he spread his army across the high ground. On the morning of September 11th, a group of Hassans attacked right across the river's bridge, and General Howe moved north to cross the river and got behind the Americans' flank. Washington held but eventually collapsed. At the Battle of Brandywine Creek, the British had 98 casualties and 400 injured. The Americans lost 200 and 400 were wounded, including Lafayette. Washington fell back to a new position behind Schuylkill River. Washington also received reinforcements of 3,100 troops. Washington then sent Alexander Hamilton to Philadelphia to warn Congress to evacuate the city. During the winter of 1777, Washington stationed his army into a winter camp at a site called Valley Forge. They had little natural cover. They also had a lack of supplies and got little relief. Many men had inadequate clothes for the winter. An estimated 17,000 to 2,000 men died during the winter of 1777 in Valley Forge. During the November of 1783, the last British troops were removed from New York, and the Treaty of Paris was signed and ratified on January 14th, 1784. In the summer of 1787, delegates from every state, with the exception of Rhode Island, gathered in Philadelphia to revise the Articles of Confederation. So came the Constitution of the United States of America. It gave the federal government the power to tax, which it did not have under the Articles of Confederation, and established 3 branches of government: executive, legislative, and judicial. It also had checks and balances. It also provided for a 2-house legislature with representation based on population in the House of Representatives and equality among states in the Senate. George Washington's election was held from December 1788 to January 1789. Washington received 69 electoral votes with the unanimous support of every participating state, with John Adams becoming his vice president. In 1792, Washington ran unopposed and once again received a unanimous mandate. John Adams was also his vice president for Washington's second term. The Bill of Rights is made up of the first 10 amendments. The Bill of Rights was proposed following the debate over the ratification of the Constitution. It guarantees personal freedoms and rights and sets clear limitations on the government's power. On December 15th, 1791, it was added to the Constitution. On December 20th, 1803, the United States took formal possession of the lands from the Louisiana Purchase, which costed $15 million, which accounting for inflation is $340 to $370 million and was made up of roughly 828,000 square miles. With the abolishment of the Atlantic slave trade, the South began to feel as if their state rights were being encroached on, and on April 12, 1861, with the election of President Abraham Lincoln, multiple states seceded from the Union. On July 1st through July 3rd, the Battle of Gettysburg took place. 95,000 Union soldiers and around 75,000 Confederates fought in the battle, with Union General John Buford securing the high ground on the first day. The Confederates pushed the Union from their position. The Union established a defensive line called the Fishhook due to its shape. General Robert E. Lee, the commander of the Confederate Army, launched aggressive attacks on both of the Union's flanks on Day 2 of the battle, and on Day 3, Lee attempted to attack the heavily defended center of the Union line in the frontal infantry assault known as Pickett's Charge, which was made up of around 12,000 Confederates. The assault failed, ending the Confederates' offensive. On July 4th, General Robert E. Lee began retreating back to Virginia, and the Confederacy's hopes for independence was dealt a heavy blow. On April 9th, 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered his army to General Ulysses S. Grant, which marked the end of the Civil War, although small, isolated Confederate forces held out for the following weeks. On January 1st, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. This executive order decreed that all enslaved peoples in the states that were rebelling, including South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee, would be set free. It's important to note that this did not set free slaves in areas that did not secede. This applied to around 4 million slaves. On April 14th, 1865, watching the play Our American Cousin in Ford Theater, Abraham Lincoln was shot in the back of the head by actor John Wilkes Booth. Booth then jumped onto the stage and managed to escape through the theater's back entrance. Lincoln later died of his injuries. On December 6, 1865, Congress ratified the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery in the United States. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery and any service done involuntarily, with the exception of a court order. For the first 2 years of World War I, America stayed neutral, but when British intelligence intercepted a German proposal to Mexico, offering them U.S. territory in exchange for joining the war effort against America. So on April 2nd, 1917, President Woodrow Wilson declared war against Germany and their allies. The Selective Service Act, or draft, was passed and grew the armed forces from 300,000 to over 4 million. Over 2 million troops were deployed to the Western Front, and by the end of the war, 116,000 soldiers died, and over 204,000 were injured. On November 11th, 1918, Germany surrendered, and on June 28th, 1919, the Treaty of Versailles was signed. In the summer of 1929, there was a massive crash in the U.S. stock market, causing the Great Depression. This caused unemployment to skyrocket from 3% to over 25%, and industrial production fell by nearly half. Also, GDP fell by 30%. On December 7th, 1941, the Imperial Japan Navy Air Force attacked the naval base at Pearl Harbor, resulting in the death of 2,403 Americans, and the United States declaring war on Japan, Germany, and Italy. Throughout the next few years, the United States drafted millions of men and deployed 11.3 million, and over 400,000 died in combat. Between December 1942 and July 1945, a group of scientists working in secret laboratories across the United States made the world's first atomic bomb. This was called the Manhattan Project. On August 6, 8:15 a.m., in Hiroshima, the B-29 bomber called the Enola Gay dropped the atomic bomb called Little Boy, killing an estimated 140,000 people. The next day, at 11 a.m., in Nagasaki, the B-29 bomber called Bockscar dropped the atomic bomb called the Fat Man, killing an estimated 60 to 80,000 people. Soon afterwards, Japan surrendered. The Cold War started in 1947, soon after the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine was a U.S. foreign policy established by President Harry S. Truman. It pledged American political, military, and economic assistance to democratic nations under threat from authoritarian forces. This was mostly to contain the spread of communism. The Cold War was a geopolitical, ideological, and economic rivalry between the United States and Soviet Union. The Cold War ended on December 26, 1991, following the collapse of the Soviet Union. A proxy war is an armed conflict where two or more major powers avoid direct fighting by using a third party, that usually being of a smaller nation, to do the fighting for them. This kind of fighting was used prominently in the Cold War. Some of these proxy wars included the Anglican Civil War, the Soviet-Afghan War, the Vietnam War, and the Korean War. On June 25, 1950, 75,000 North Korean troops crossed the 38th parallel. The goal of these troops was to forcefully unify the Korean peninsula under communist control. The Soviet Union supported the North Koreans by supplying the North Koreans with heavy military equipment, including Soviet tanks, artillery, and aircraft. They also provided tactical and strategic planning and sent 3,000 to 5,000 military advisors, but did not deploy large-scale ground combat troops. The United States supported South Korea by orchestrating an amphibious assault and sent 1.9 million troops. In 1954, the Supreme Court case Brown v. Board declared that state laws that separated public schools for black and white students was unconstitutional, and overturned the court case Plessy v. Ferguson, which legalized segregation. Starting on April 17th and lasting until April 20th, 1961, 1,400 Cuban exiles, armed and trained by the CIA, planned to launch a surprise attack against Cuba, establish a provisional government, and spark anti-Castro uprising across Cuba. The plan failed due to a loss of surprise, as Cuban intelligence was aware of the exile training camps and the impending attack, and the pre-invasion airstrikes were meant to destroy the Cuban Air Force, which missed multiple targets. In 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis was a tense 13-day confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union, and is considered the closest point to full-on nuclear war. The reason for the Cuban Missile Crisis was because of the Soviet Union moving nuclear weapons to Cuba. In response, President John F. Kennedy ordered a blockade of Cuba, and on October 28, 1962, the Soviet Union announced that they would remove all nuclear weapons from Cuba. On November 22, 1963, while President John F. Kennedy was riding in an open-top motorcade through Dealey Plaza in Dallas, Texas, he was fatally shot by Lee Harvey Oswald. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act was signed into law. The Civil Rights Act prohibited segregation. It also prohibited discrimination in private employment based on race, sex, or national origin. On another proxy war between the United States and the Soviet Union was the Vietnam War. North Vietnam was supported by the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union sent billions of dollars in military hardware, economic aid, and thousands of military advisors to North Vietnam. The United States sent over 2.7 million troops to Vietnam. On April 4th, 1968, at 6:05, Martin Luther King Jr. was shot dead while on a balcony outside in his second-floor motel room at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. News of his death sent a shockwave through the nation. On June 16, 1972, in room 214 of the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C., multiple people linked to President Nixon's re-election campaign were caught trying to break into the Democratic National Committee headquarters. And later, on August 8, 1974, Richard Nixon addressed the nation after being informed that he'd lost the support of Congress. And he said that the nation needed a full-time president, and that in the interest of the nation, he would resign. In the November of 1986, President Ronald Reagan confirmed reports that the United States had secretly sold weapons to Iran. This was known as the Iran-Contra affair, that resulted in the resignation of National Secretary Advisor John Poindexter's resignation. The White House Chief of Staff was forced out. There were also criminal indictments. 14 administration and intelligence officials were charged with criminal offenses. On August 2, 1990, Saddam Hussein, the leader of Iraq, invaded Kuwait. The United States, in response, put Operation Desert Shield in place. Operation Desert Shield was a massive military buildup in Saudi Arabia. Starting in January 1991, after Iraq defied a United Nations deadline to withdraw, Operation Desert Storm was commenced, which was the U.S.-led combat phase of the Gulf War, lasting from January 17th to February 28th, 1991. The air campaign started on January 17, 1991, with massive aerial and naval bombardments targeting Iraqi military, infrastructure, communications, and air defense. On February 24th, U.S. forces swept through the Iraqi defenses. The ground war lasted less than 100 hours before a ceasefire was declared. American Airlines Flight 11, in the morning of September 11, 2001, was hijacked by 5 members of the terrorist group Al-Qaeda, and at 8:46, the hijacked plane was flown directly into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. 92 people were on board of American Airlines Flight 11. Just 17 minutes later, another hijacked flight, American Airlines Flight 175, was flown into the South Tower of the World Trade Center. 65 people were on the plane. At 9:37, American Airlines Flight 77 was flown into the western side of the U.S. Department of Defense headquarters, otherwise known as the Pentagon. 64 people were on American Airlines Flight 77. The passengers and crew on American Airlines Flight 93 fought back against the hijackers, causing the plane to crash into a field at 10:03. 44 people were on American Airlines Flight 93. At 9:59, the South Tower of the World Trade Center collapsed, and at 10:28, the North Tower collapsed, with a total of 2,977 victims in the attack. The War on Terror was triggered by the 9/11 terrorist attacks, and was launched by President George W. Bush. It began with the invasion of Afghanistan in the October of 2001, to topple the Taliban regime. Some major operations in the War on Terror were the capture of Iraqi President Saddam Hussein, as well as the killing of Osama bin Laden. In 2008, there was a catastrophic financial collapse triggered by the bursting of the U.S. housing market bubble. The collapse of the banking system froze global credit markets. An estimated 10 million Americans lost their homes. The Affordable Care Act, passed under the Obama administration, restructured how Americans accessed health insurances. And in 2011, U.S. Navy SEALs killed Osama bin Laden. And in 2015, in the Supreme Court case Obergefell v. Hodges, it guaranteed the fundamental right to marriage for same-sex couples nationwide. In the March of 2020, in response to COVID-19, the United States declared a national emergency. The pandemic caused healthcare strain, and hospitals faced severe shortages of personal protective equipment and ventilators, pushing healthcare to its structural limits. There was also an economic toll. The United States experienced supply chain disruptions alongside sharp economic contractions. The estimated total cost associated with the loss of economic output and healthcare strains exceeds $16 trillion. In 2021, under the Biden administration, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act was signed into law, authorizing billions for roads, bridges, and the power grid. There was also a complete withdrawal from Afghanistan. In 2022, the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, eliminating the constitutional right to an abortion. In the past year, under Donald Trump's administration, many people were killed by Immigration and Customs Enforcement, otherwise known as ICE, with, in just his second term, 32 documented deaths, which is much higher than previous administrations. Starting on February 28, 2026, the U.S. and Israel were at war with Iran. The conflict started after U.S.-Israeli bombings killed Iranian officials and the Iranian Supreme Leader, Ali Khamenei. I don't know how to say it. Iran fired back missiles and drones on Israel. They also bombed U.S.-aligned Arab countries and U.S. military bases. A total of over 1,770 missiles were fired, as well as over 3,955 drones. On June 17th, the initial ceasefire was signed. However, their diplomatic efforts are ongoing. Over 250 years, our great nation has grown from a small group of 13 colonies to the country with the #1 Army, Navy, Air Force, space program, and GDP. And I have briefly gone over the history of our great nation, of the United States. Thank you for watching. If there's something you'd like me to go more in depth with, or a different topic you'd like me to talk about, please tell me in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And this was the Bluish Banner. Happy July 4th, and God bless America.